So here we are in the Art Institute of Chicago in the African Galleries, speaking with Dr. Delinda Collier, who is an expert on contemporary African art. Now, before we hear from Delinda, I want to encourage you to study African art. This is not an African art class. Obviously, we're doing modernism and postmodernism, and we're talking about the moderns who are interested in African art and why. But the continent is rich in deep traditions of art making, so take another MOOC, study African art. So what's the fascination with the African object? What did they know about Africa?
They knew, it depends on the artist. So there's, what's really important, I think, to notice first off is the way that these objects are displayed. So we're in a museum now which has the same setup generally as it did in the early 20th century. The early 20th century museums and ethnographers and anthropologists and so on were trying to figure out how to place objects in a museum from other cultures, because what automatically happens when you take an object off of the African continent is that it loses its context in a way. So it loses its context both in terms of its knowledge base, but also in terms of it just being a detached object from an entire masquerade. So that could be a performance, it could be an entire costume made with raffia or whatever kind of linens. But the basic kind of premise of these types of displays is that they're treated as sculptural objects.
So when you say the context, these were a part of a larger performative ritual sometimes.
Exactly,
okay.
exactly.
Right.
Sometimes they were more political performances. Masquerade can be a very political and very public performance, or it can also be a ritual and very closed off and secretive kind of performance.
So before you tell us about what we're looking at, say something about colonialism.
Right.
Please.
So the reason that these objects were in Europe is because of colonialism. That's the simplest way to say that. And in some cases, these were brought back from expeditions that European leaders made to either punish the people who lived in Africa for not kind of cooperating with their trade networks, or to as just friendly trade objects, right? This since the 15th century, we've had a really healthy trade of objects between the two continents. So it varies anywhere in between. So that's why there's such a large variety also. And so when these early modern artists were looking at these objects, they didn't have necessarily this context. They didn't understand. There's a debate about whether they cared about that context, or whether they wanted to also just look at it in terms of pure sculptural form.
So Picasso, for instance, we've used this term primitivism in quotes, so there's an attraction towards, again, the other, quote, so there's a move away from the Greco-Roman canon as a format to be followed, and an interest in what they saw as a more pure, more instinctual, more
and
noble,
non-European.
And non-European.
Yeah.
So tell us about these masks. What would Picasso and Derain and others been looking at? What would they have enjoyed as a sculptural object?
So in terms of this Poona Mask, I think this is a really good place for us to start, because this Poona Mask, or objects like it, were very popular in flea markets and in museum collections. So this,
in Paris, flea markets in Paris or in London. Okay.
Right. So an object much like this was pictured in Picasso's studio. Matisse also modeled his portrait of his wife after this piece. So this is what I would call morphological primitivism, and morphological just means that they were looking at the object and copying it. That they looked at it and said, oh, this is a really remarkable way of treating a face. So I'm going to copy this, basically, and incorporate it into the painting. So that's, this is a direct copy kind of situation. And for the most part, in the 10s and 20s, that's the type of primitivism that was being practiced, was in painting a direct copy.
And an attraction to form.
To form.
Without necessarily understanding what the object would have been used for in Africa.
Exactly. And part of that attraction was precisely that mystery.
Oh, interesting.
That we didn't want to know, because all we know is that it came to us through these kind of mysterious ways, and we don't really know what the artist was. We don't know who the artist is. We don't know what he or she was thinking. Which I think was part of the attraction.
Let's walk around and look at one other object. So, Delinda, this is a great piece
Yeah.
to talk about, I think, the Gabon Reliquary, because note the striations
Right.
on the cheeks, and this is something we talked about with the Demoiselle d'Avignon, that's a major clue that he's looking at African art. Tell us about
Right.
this work.
This work is a perfect example of why to treat something like, as a sculptural object has its has its ups and its downs, right? Because this is a reliquary figure, which means that it's meant to be attached to a reliquary, something. It's a container for some kind of charged object. We have European reliquaries where pieces of saints' bodies are put inside of something. So what's missing here is the actual reliquary. So we only have the figure that goes on top of it, which is kind of the least important part in terms of this as an African object. But again, it was this form of the sculptural top, or the kind of the decoration piece, that really interested Picasso.
So what would this have been used for? So tell us, a reliquary would be living where in the community?
It would be in a shrine. It would be in a shrine, so it wouldn't be seen necessarily. Depends again on the culture, but generally reliquaries all depend on something being hidden and exposed at the same time. So it's this dualism between the hidden and the exposed, which again, perhaps some of these artists knew that. Perhaps they knew some of this background, and again, that served as a mystery, kind of, the veiling and unveiling process of the figure. But so what they did again was to just kind of look at the actual treatment of the face.
So
and
the
to
formal
copy that.
quality, formal quality.
Right. And so that was at first what somebody like Picasso was interested in. Later he would do a lot of pieces that really tried to think in terms of what sculpture was and what painting was, and to try to figure out spatial ideas based on the lessons that he was learning from African art.
So the construction of the, the sculptural construction.
Right, its attenuation, or the way it's put together versus it trying to be a realistic object.
So this morphological primitivism, that term you use, so for instance, that the continuous eyebrow,
which you see constantly in painting at the time. You'll see it in the expressionist paintings. You'll see it, in a lot of the German.
The eyes.
What they call the coffee bean kind of shape eye.
I see. And then the striations.
Right, the striations. But also, so this is, we would look at this and this would be so iconically African for us, right? And again, just keep in mind that the reason this is so iconically African for us is because this was the cultural group which was most heavily collected from the continent. This is ignoring North Africa, a lot of Southern Africa. This is really putting a preference on this really rich body of sculptural production in
Gabon.
in Central Africa. So that
because they were there as colonialists.
They were there. And after a while, Africans started to notice the interest that Europeans had in these objects and started to produce them solely for that trade.
Oh, interesting.
So a lot of what you see in museums may or may not be that
authentic,
from that.
if you will. Yeah. So this is such a rich collection of work here. We're looking at masks, but there are stools, there are textiles, there are other kinds of objects. And what's interesting, I think, is the way the African art will be a real part of the life of the community, right? As distinctive from the Western model, where
in classical African art.
African art at that time.
Right. And these days, what's sort of ironic about this situation was that it was at this very same moment that those practices were being extinguished by those people who settled into Africa and kind of put a stop to masquerade practices, what they thought were voodoo, or there are mistranslations of these practices. So this is at once a memorialization of a practice, but also kind of a fetishization of that kind of Africa. Right?
Masquerade practices, that's what they're called. So if you want to look this up, masquerade practices. So finally, tell us, the museum, are we still putting forward objects, sort of decontextualized, if you will, or what's the museum doing to give us a better grasp of the African aesthetic and practice?
So this is a really good gallery for to kind of teach us about those practices, because this one was reinstalled in, I think, 2011, and so the curator at the time really thought carefully about how context works. So what she did was to preserve both the history of the museum, which treats these objects as sculptural objects. So as you can see, most of the objects in here are treated in that way. But she's also included more didactic information on the labels, meaning, explaining what culture group they come from and how they were practiced. But also what's not playing now is a film that was created in order to sort of show how masks are danced, how they're performed within the community. But whatever you do, you're going to have to select, right? So we still have a very classical idea of African art in this gallery. It's just sort of a decision that's been made about how they want to collect. And the other thing that we're getting here today that we haven't in the past is the far North Africa, which is on the other side of the gallery, and far South Africa. So those two parts of the continent were normally kind of left off. We have Ethiopian Christian art in here now, which was not, at the time in the early 20th century, really important for artists.
Interesting.
Yeah.
And then finally, because you're a scholar of contemporary art, just very quickly, of course, this course stops in the 80s, but art will get very, very global. Contemporary art will get very, very global just soon after in the 90s, so that today, African art is mixed up with everybody else's, and you see great contemporary African art when you travel around the world to various biennials. And what happened? Is that easy?
I think what happened is that we sort of came to an understanding that this had always been happening. So in 1915, for instance, you have a Nigerian artist, Ina Nabulu, who traveled to London to take painting courses. And he was typical. So now in the 90s, we sort of realized that was always a two-directional flow. So what we're getting here is kind of that interest of Europeans in Africa, but that went both ways.
So the contemporary artist in Africa has always been active. The West just started paying attention in the 90s.
Yeah. And now we're trying to do all that work to sort of figure that out.
So take a contemporary African survey. That's what you need to do. Thanks, Delinda.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks.